right, everybody, and we are here today again on the Fanatic Wrestling podcast, and we are joined today by a good friend of mine and somebody that I really look up to. I'm really excited to talk to him today, Mr. Hudson Taylor. How you doing today, Hudson?
I'm doing well, man. Thanks for having me.
Man, one of the best University of Maryland Terps. I'm a University of Maryland Terrapin myself. One of the best Terps of all time. A top 10 NCAA pinner, and one of the most unique personalities that I feel like I've seen go through wrestling. And so I'm really excited for this whole thing. As I look through this, Hudson, first thing I want to ask you is, how's the Magic career going?
Well, I always have a deck of cards either in my hand or an arm's reach away. So, yeah, I've been steadily working on a Magic book for what feels like forever. So I've kept Magic close to me. It's always in my mind. And as you know, it actually was a huge part of my wrestling career because I think any athlete who's competing at an elite level, it's certainly really stressful when a big match is coming up, when you're on the road traveling a ton. And so for me, Magic was always an outlet for me to kind of get my mind right and just decompress, not stress so much about competition. So I encourage any athlete to find that passion, find that hobby that they can carry with them off the wrestling mat, because I think it definitely helped me in my career. And yeah, I still trying to keep that magic alive as much as I can.
So I find that fascinating because I think everybody has like a little trick or two, right? Did you seek out magic? Did you seek out something to fill that anxiety killing space, or did it just sort of naturally happen?
So I started wrestling when I was 6, and cards came into my life because of wrestling tournaments. When I was in 4th, 5th, 6th grade, I was going to a wrestling tournament almost every single weekend, and I was with this team of other wrestlers. And as every wrestler knows, you spend a few short minutes competing, and then you spend many, many hours waiting to compete. And that space in between competition, we needed to fill with something. And so we would oftentimes fill that space with, spades or hearts, or, name your card game of choice. And then when we exhausted all of our, card playing competition, inevitably somebody would say, "Hey, do you know any card tricks?" And somebody always knows one. I think everybody has a card trick that their uncle taught them. And so that was really the beginning for me, is that we would kind of, over the course of wrestling tournaments, trade magic tricks, and I would learn what my teammates knew. I would teach them what I knew, and then at a certain point, as is I think the case, like I very much am of the opinion that a person can be great at almost everything if they just commit themselves to learning, and they're patient and they practice. And when it came to Magic, I started seeing magicians hold cards and perform effects and do techniques that I was so far away from being able to do. But I really was like, you know what? If I just am patient and I practice, I can also do that. And so the technician in me just became obsessed with trying to master these sleights. And so then I started buying books and DVDs and really turned it from being this, tournament hobby that we would use to kill time to being something that I became really passionate about.
Were you studying at the same time that you're going and you're voraciously studying all this magic technique? We might need to get you to do an instructional series on that one day, by the way.
Happily, yeah.
It might happen. We're expanding quick. So are you also at the same time studying wrestling in the same way, going out and seeking information in the same way, or is magic a little bit more on the front of your mind?
Magic, it's the beautiful thing about Magic is that you don't need a partner. You don't need someone to be drilling with you and training with you to really improve. And so it was this great kind of solo journey that I was on. That being said, I grew up on VHS tapes of, old legendary dual meets and wrestling matches. And definitely, I have a very close relationship with even technique videos. I mean, I think that it's one of the things that's so interesting about really all kind of grappling arts is that when you look back at the 1920, you know, you look back at wrestlers from the 20s and you look at their technique and it's like, what is that? You know, what sport are they doing? You know, they look like little kids. You know, they look so unsophisticated in their technique. And the truth is that in wrestling and in so many other martial arts, it was really an oral tradition, and we could only improve at the speed with which we were taught, and we could only be taught by face-to-face interaction with another person. And I think that once we had the video camera and we're able to actually record technique, record competition, it allowed for there to be a global, global learning to take place. You know,
The
I can,
enlightenment, as it were. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I can now study the technique of somebody who lives on the other side of the world, who I will never meet, who maybe lived a long time ago. You know, and I think that has really allowed for a sort of an evolution of technique. You know, you see young competitors who are just accelerating so much faster than a generation prior. And I think we see it in wrestling, we see it in jiu-jitsu, we see it in, I would assume it's probably similar in judo and in other kind of, martial arts. But yeah, for that reason, technique and the videos that help give someone technique have always been really important to me.
Do you happen to remember any that made a particular impression on you?
Yeah, John Smith, How Low Can You Go was definitely a big one, because I think the thing that always struck me about great competitors is that, you know, it wasn't the case that they were great at everything. They weren't world class at all techniques. They were certainly a lot better than other people, but I think the best competitors were the best at one or two things. You know, and John Smith, and you could say it of Cale Sanderson, you could say it of so many elite competitors, they are the best at the one thing, and nobody can stop them from doing that. And I think that the How Low Can You Go series was something that really opened my eyes to this idea of, here's a single technique, the low leg single, that can be sort of expanded to be applied to so many different scenarios. And, you know, here's a guy who used this sort of the toolkit of techniques to be the best in the world for a really long time. And so, you know, if you could have, you know, a 10 out of 10 of one technique, and everybody else in the world has a 7 out of 10 in their defense to that technique, you're gonna find success. And so that was, again, that How Low Can You Go series was just something that I think made me realize that the importance of specialization of technique, that I don't have to be exceptional in all things, but if I can be exceptional in one or two or five offensive, five defensive skill sets, I'm going to have a great wrestling career.
Do you remember taking that? Because then from there, you know, we're talking about you maybe, you know, 9, 10, 11, and then getting older, you eventually wrestle in high school at Blair Academy in New Jersey, one of the most prestigious academies for wrestling in the country, under Jeff Buxton, one of the best coaches. Amazing stuff. Do you remember making these conscious decisions about trying to get good at things, and do you remember which things they might have been?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first real conscious decisions that started to be made when it came to both my technical development, but also my competitive development, which I think are two different things, right?
Can you explain the difference?
Well, I think that there's a lot of athletes who have the technique. They're flawless. They can execute the technique perfectly. They might even be able to execute that technique perfectly in a live situation in the wrestling room or during practice. But once the uniform is on, and once the whistle blows, and once there's an audience and there's now pressure on the line, their ability to convert their knowledge into competitive success varies greatly. And
Gotcha.
there are some people who, you know, maybe they suck in practice, but they just bring it. You know, they bring it in competition. And I think that that's one of those kind of things that it's very hard to teach. But if you can find a way of learning that competitive knowledge, that competitive growth, it's also really important. So for me, in my own journey as an athlete, there was a time period where I was very focused on that like technical development, and that was a wrestling club that I was a Red Hawk wrestler in Peaburg, in New Jersey, and there was this beautiful system of really riding on top, where we had the same practice that we would have every Monday. We would have a specific series that we would train on Mondays, a specific series that we would train on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, Friday, and it would just repeat. And so it really just built this muscle memory and this knowledge base that I think was a really important foundation for future refinement and future growth. And then when I got to Blair, that was really when kind of the first time one of my coaches there was Solomon Fleckman, who, I'd be wrestling in these, against the best competition in the country. I'd win a match, I'd walk off the mat, and he would open up a little notebook and start to run down all the errors that I had made in that match, even if I had won, right? And I think that was a really important process for me, because it requires work to be a student of your own game, right? To actually say, hey, I could have done things differently. I should have done things differently, both offensively and defensively. I should have managed that match better. And so that was really when I started to look critically about at my own competing. And it really helped me think about, okay, if I have 6 or 7 minutes to win a match, how do I use that time to be as effective as possible? And that's when I actually started to develop more of a strategy to say, okay, I have all the techniques. I know my areas where I need to grow technically, but in terms of match strategy and time management, there still is, I think, a lot more growth that I should have done, that any athlete can do, to be a better competitor.
That's something I remember, because I was actually the person you were crunching around for the series that you shot for Fanatic Wrestling. Yeah, you made a bunch of really interesting points tying effort to time, and you want to score with this much time in the match, so you can do this for this much time. And it was really broken down to a level of specificity I really hadn't seen before, and I thought that was really interesting. And that comes from that, it sounds like.
Yeah. I mean, definitely that was sort of the origins of it. I think that, the college rule set adds some interesting variables that you also really need to take into consideration, namely riding time.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's one of the reasons why you see great high school wrestlers don't always transition to great college wrestlers, because the match strategy is so important in a college wrestling match. So what I mean by this is, okay, I'll take you into my mind a little bit of the sort of the match strategy. For me, my pathway to victory is almost, if you broke down all of the matches that I won, I would say probably 95% of them, I had riding time at the end of that match, right? So it was very clear to me that if I didn't get riding time, it was going to be exponentially harder for me to find a pathway to victory. Because, there are all these other things that go along with not having riding time. If you're not getting riding time, that means that you are not in a dominant position for a longer period of time throughout the match. Mm-hmm. So for me, it was, okay, how can I maximize the amount of riding time that I can get in a match? I knew that there were very few people in the country that could get out on bottom. There were very few people that I couldn't turn and couldn't pin. So it was really all geared towards, how do I get on top as fast as possible? Now in a college wrestling match, you have 7 minutes, right? And so in that first period, 3 minutes is a long time to be on your feet. And I've seen so many amazing wrestlers who just are not as aggressive offensively as they should be, to get to a position where they can end the first period with 30 to 45 seconds of riding time. That for me is the ultimate goal in for sort of first period strategy. If you can end the first period with 30 to 45 seconds of riding time, I think you will be very hard to beat, because you can kind of stall your way to getting to that minute. You then can choose neutral in the second or third period. You can kind of stall or hand fight your way to not getting taken down. And in very short order, if you can end the first period with 30 to 45 seconds of riding time, I think you can beat some of the best people in the country. And so a lot of my game, a lot of my strategy is really designed at, okay, how do we get on top as fast as possible? How do we create scrambles to at least create action that, you know, maybe even if I get taken down, I can then get a reversal and again, start building up that riding time. And that's again where I really excelled was on the mat, was on top, turning people, tearing shoulders up. But yeah, I think that analytics is really important. And you know, I've had the opportunity now to do some training with so many MMA fighters. And I'm always so impressed by how much studying they do of their opponents. You know, they have such a statistical breakdown of the people who they're going to be competing against, you know, 6 months into the future. And I think that in wrestling in particular, there were very few of us who really had that same level of study of our opponents as some of the other you know, martial arts that exist. So I think that analysis is critically important to success, unless you are just that much better than everyone else, in which case you can just do what you want. But for me, I always wanted to have that game plan. I wanted to have that strategy because, you know, I think that's one of the tools in your arsenal to be successful.
I totally agree. I want to ask you, and that's something I'm noticing the more I talk to elite athletes, is that self-coaching and those self-coaching loops that they get into. I want to ask you just a little bit, maybe even more broadly, about riding time in general, because I know it can be a little controversial. So for anybody that's listening that maybe doesn't understand what riding time is, there's 2 clocks in college wrestling. There's the regulation clock. Everybody knows it. It's counting down to 0 from 7 minutes. There's also a riding time clock. When one person's on top, the clock's going to go in their favor. When the other person's on top, it's going to go back in the other person's favor. If you get to 1 minute at the end of the match, they give you an additional point. Some people, Hudson, have criticized this because they say that it incentivizes stall riding, where you're just trying to stay on top, mat return, you know, go to ankles. We had to put in a caution rule. You're somebody, you know, first question, are you in favor of riding time as a concept? Sounds like yes.
Well, I mean, yes and no. I look, I love riding time because I was really good on top, right? So like, I'm going to get riding time in most of my matches. That being said, the people who have the opinion that it's disincentivizes maybe like action and incentivizes stalling are 100% right. I mean, if you don't have the tools to turn somebody on top, your next course of action is to literally just hang on, and the rules require you to do that. So yeah, I think there's a lot of people who are just trying to literally kind of hang on top and just get the clock going in their favor. Of course, that's not the way that it needs to be. I mean, I was always hungry to turn somebody to get a pin. I didn't want a stalemate. I didn't want a stalling call. That was, you know, the last thing on my mind. But I honestly think about a lot of riding on top as being a fine line between like passivity and aggression. You know, like what are the things that you need to do to just maintain a hold on someone, which is your passive, your stalling, and then what are the things that you need to do to actually be working towards a fall. And there's this sort of tension because every time you try to be the aggressor, you also open yourself up to maybe that person can use your momentum against you. They can, you know, use that to potentially get out. It's really hard to escape from somebody who's just riding parallel, doing nothing, really just purely stalling. So yeah, so I'm of two minds about it. I think that yes, it can be abused. Again, it's true in a lot of other, there are rules in jiu-jitsu that I think disincentivize action. That tactics, we see that a lot. But in all of this, that's not to say that there isn't offensive opportunity there, and so I don't think we should shy away from change the rules just because there are some people who are not as aggressive as they should be. If anything, we just intensify the stalling calls, and I think that the rules have been better about, like getting in a Merkle position. Like there are different ways in which the refs will call stalling sooner, which I think is healthy and good, and hopefully accounts for that concern of stalling on top.
So in an age where there are, I won't even say most, but many people are just riding on top. I'll say most. Most people are just riding on top to trying to pick up that riding tide point, right? You were
Mhm.
somebody who was incredibly successful from this position. You were one of the top 10 pinners in NCAA history, which is an incredible accomplishment. What was the shift for you where you were being successful where other people maybe weren't? Was it just your technical understanding? Was it mentality? You kind of touched on this, but I just want to hammer this down.
Yeah, so certainly there was a piece of it that was very technical. I figured out how to ride legs and throw a half in a way that didn't matter how much muscle you had. I was gonna, I was gonna get you to turn and expose your back, and I could convert back points to falls almost every time. So if I was getting back points, I knew that I could pin you. Period. Um, that being said, I think the other piece that I did a lot of that is super important to me is that in the practice room, I almost always drilled takedown to back points, takedown to getting my partner to be flat on the mat. I think that the greatest opportunity to score back points or a fall is in the transition. And it's in the transition when you get the reversal. It's in the transition when you mat return somebody, when you get the takedown. It's in that 1 second where your opponent is having that negative self-talk that you need to be striking the hardest. And I don't think enough people train in such a way that enables them to take advantage of that 1 second of their opponent's negative self-talk. So for me, it was always kind of to think about how do I capitalize on that moment when when somebody lands on the side of their hip because you just taken them down, they're a lot closer to their back than they are to escaping. And I think that not enough wrestlers kind of are proportionately aggressive with the opportunity that they've been presented.
You mentioned no matter how strong they were, you were a guy, you wrestled at 197 pounds, but you didn't necessarily always weigh 197 pounds, Hudson. You weren't the biggest 197 in the country for sure. So
Yeah.
you were often giving up a little bit of length, a little bit of muscle. Did you prefer that, or can you tell me about this is a sport where everybody's trying to get a size advantage, but you were a guy without a size advantage, still
Yeah.
pinning everybody. What's up there?
Yeah. I mean, I weighed about kind of 195 most of the season. I was never. Yeah. No. I was always around 197. I was always like maybe one workout away from being underweight, but also eating whatever I wanted. So I definitely wasn't cutting any weight. I yeah. I also was by far, I think I was one of the weakest guys on the team. If you look at me in the weight room trying to bench or like, I could lift very little weight with my upper body. Maybe I could do okay when it came to squats or something, but even in the weight room and actually lifting weights, I was not at all as strong as I should have been for the weight class. Now, sometimes I do think about if I should have dropped down to 84. I think that any athlete who doesn't win a national title is going to have fantasies about what they should have done differently to accomplish those goals. And I'm certainly there as well, right? You beat people who are national champs at the weight class beneath you, and you're like, ah. But when it came to actually competing at 97, I'm a big believer that I want to be at the apex of my ability every time I step on the mat. And I think there are a lot of wrestlers who there's this sort of like inverse correlation, like if you cut too much weight, you're just not going to be the best version of yourself when you step out on the mat. Now there's, I think, a certain amount of cutting weight in which you can, get back the fluids and the nutrients you need to be competitive an hour or two later, right? When your name is called. But for me, I always just wanted to be able to focus on competing and being able to focus on wrestling as best as I possibly could. So I never wanted to sacrifice my diet, my not my happiness, but like, you know, that wasn't a piece of my sacrifice that I think I needed to be successful athletically. And so as a result, every single time I stepped on the mat, I was completely healthy and happy. And also as a result, I wrestled a crazy amount of matches. I mean, I was trying to compete every single weekend throughout the entire year. Whether we had a dual meet or not, I would want to go to an open tournament just to clock more mat time. I mean, and that would not have been possible had I been cutting weight. But because I chose not to cut weight, I could really focus on applying all of myself to being as competitively successful as possible.
What does it mean to you to be one of the top 10 NCAA pinners of all time?
I mean, it feels great. I'm obsessed with pinning, and it was I entered every single match assuming that I was going to pin the person. I wasn't looking to win. I wasn't looking to tech, to major, to win by decision. I was looking to pin the person. And there were very few matches in which I was like, oh, this is a person that maybe I can't pin, right? Like the matches that I was not trying to pin the person was, you know, Jake Varner and Craig Brester were like the two people who I was like, all right, these guys, they're dangerous. They're really tough. I don't know if I can pin them. So I need to just focus on winning. And, you know, it's interesting because it's the matches where I actually went out to pin are the matches where I did the best. And when I think I was in the mindset of just winning is when it was the most challenging. So, yeah, it feels great. I mean, about 50% of my matches came by way of fall. So I accomplished my goals about 50% of the time, and felt great doing it.
So you're somebody that accomplished a ton of goals and was obviously super successful, but you were super successful at a program that isn't traditionally thought of as a power. Now, you had offers coming out of Blair Academy. You're very, you know, you were well recruited to very, you know, teams that people would recognize as more elite. Why was Maryland the right choice for you?
Yeah, great question. I could have gone to a lot of different schools, and I looked at a lot of different schools. But for me, so I would say the first thing I think that I realized that any Division I athlete, any athlete can be successful at any school if they apply themselves, and I fully believe that. I think that you get back what you put in, and I think that the quality of coaching, the quality of training is at such a level that you can go to any Division I school in the country and be a national champion. I do think that. I do believe that. It might require more work, more effort. Mm-hmm. There might be more barriers to you accomplishing those goals from one school to the next. But for me, I didn't feel like I needed to go to one of those dynasties to accomplish those goals. So I was really looking at schools that I felt I could both be athletically successful, but also could be an individual, that I could pursue things outside of the mat. I think that sometimes, and I don't know if this is right or wrong, but my perception is that there are some programs that try to mold all of their athletes into an archetype, right? That there's this one model of success that a lot of athletes kind of get molded into. And it's a very successful mold. Don't get me wrong, but I didn't want that. I wanted to be my own self. I wanted to sort of excel athletically, academically. And Maryland was a place where I really felt like I could do both. I mean, I started at Maryland as a theater major and a music minor in vocal performance. There were very few other D1 schools where I felt like I could do theater, where it was like not completely frowned upon, even in the recruiting process. And Maryland was a school that was, Pat Santoro was coaching at the time. I really get excited about the idea of building something, about creating something, leaving a legacy. And Pat was really trying to do that at Maryland. And that inspired me, that motivated me. I think we were able to do that. And yeah, I'm really proud and happy with my decision.
Man, your career was awesome, and it was so much fun to watch you as a friend go out there and kick people's butts so often. I can't tell you how many times we would be down like by 8 in a duel, and it'd be like, oh no, it's fine because Hudson's gonna pin this guy, and then Pat will win in overtime. we're going to
Mm-hmm.
win the duel. And that happened many, many times, I feel like. Uh,
Yeah.
Most especially with your move that you end up showing on the series called the Moneymaker. Can you tell me what is the Moneymaker and why is it called the Moneymaker?
I call it the moneymaker. So the moneymaker is when I have two legs in. It's just my technique for a very simple half Nelson. But when I look at the 87 pins that I had in college, I would say about 75 of them came from this specific move. So, it was like this was the position that I felt like if I got you in this position, I was 100% going to pin you. Like guaranteed every single time. And I knew that I was going to get the fall a good 45 seconds before the fall occurred, only because of like the leverage that I could feel 7 steps prior.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I call it the moneymaker just because it's literally what the single series of techniques that enabled me to turn and pin like almost everybody in the country. um, yeah, so and again, as somebody who wasn't the strongest or the most athletic, wasn't oversized for my weight class, it for me is it's very much about the details and the technique, and where your body position is and when you push and when you pull. So it's not that flashy of a technique, but there are lots of very little details that, if done correctly, I think anybody can use this half Nelson to pin anyone.
I agree. I also think you dropped some great throughout this series. Obviously, there's so many amazing techniques for back points, for pinfalls, but you also dropped so many great pieces of advice that are not just for one technique. Like I remember, I think it may have been during the Moneymaker, or it may have been during another technique. You mentioned something that just keeps running through my head as I watch people work on top. It's that before you pin the guy, there has to be a second where he wants to get pinned. Can you tell me
Yeah,
about that and like kind of when you realize that and like what that means?
yeah. Well, I think in every match, there's this phrase to knock the heart out, and I think that in every match there's at the start of a match when the whistle blows, you likely have two people who have equal effort. They're equally confident in their ability to win, maybe, right? But you want to beat me just as much as I want to beat you, and then somebody scores. Okay, so then you get knocked down a peg or you get lifted up a peg. And there's this sort of tug of war between your will to win that's happening at every second throughout the course of the match. And I think when it comes to the pin, for me and the moneymaker at least, like my falls were never fast falls, right? I pinned a lot of people. Very, very, very few of them were in the first period. They were almost always towards the end of the second period, because that's the amount of time that I needed to kind of grind the will away
Mm-hmm.
until I kind of could feel and could see that they had lost the will to win, and that it was just pure survival. And so yeah, you have to knock the heart out. You have to sort of find that moment in which you can really take victory from the mind of your opponent. And the series with the legs and with riding double boots and the half, it's a slow process to turn somebody that really requires you to, like, I'm almost in communication with the referee, making sure that they don't call a stalemate, because that's the worst thing in the world, that they say, oh, hey, you're not progressing enough in this position, let's go back. So my goal is to go as slow as possible towards the fall, kind of riding that line between stalemate and a pin, such that by the time I start getting back points in my count, I know definitively that I'm going to get the fall. And yeah, I'm always thinking about kind of that tempo of competition. I also think that momentum is the enemy of pinning, right? If I want to pin somebody, I need to slow down the pace, because all of the momentum that I put into turning somebody is momentum that they can take to get off of their back to escape the position. And I think that that's one of the errors that I see a lot of wrestlers make. When you do put somebody on their back, it's exciting. You get that rush of adrenaline. The crowd is cheering. You have that that moment, that dopamine rush where you're like, oh my gosh, I've done it. They're on their back. And that I think that excitement sometimes it makes us move faster than we otherwise should. And the truth is that if you want to increase the number of pins that you get, you should slow down. You should, inch from one shoulder to two shoulders. You want to slowly rock your opponent's shoulder blade to the mat, because I think that's how you lead them to a dead end, to a checkmate, and how you really increase the number of pins that you're getting in a match.
I was trying to think of who else on the site did I hear say this, and I realize now it was Steve Mocco. So it must be the Blair thing.
Yeah.
It doesn't hurt to train in one of the best wrestling academies in the country. Hudson, I want to transition over and start talking about the series that you shot with us. It's available now at Fanatic Wrestling. If anybody who's listening to the podcast wants to check it out, it'll actually be linked in the show notes for them. This is an incredible top-bottom series with an unbelievable amount of technique, but it starts out with a lot of philosophy, and you kind of breaking down like what you call in here like the 8 major positions of wrestling. How often are you thinking theoretically in these broad scopes about wrestling? You know what I mean?
Yeah, in the process of working with you all, it really gave me an opportunity to reflect on my own wrestling journey and how I was taught wrestling. And it made me realize that there are ways in which I've come to think about wrestling today, which was not how I was taught wrestling when I was a kid or growing up. And that sort of initial overview was kind of one of my opportunities to, I think, create a better orientation for how I like to think about both offensive and defensive opportunities in the sport. And I think that, frankly, this has been a part of my process through jiu-jitsu. I think that it's been interesting to see how folks in the jiu-jitsu community orient philosophy, or orient technique, orient sort of hierarchies of offense and defense. And I think that, really what required me to think about how do we apply that same thinking to wrestling. And so, yeah, I try to break down, wrestling is made up of, obviously there's kind of this like unlimited number of techniques that you can learn, but there's a very limited number of positions within which you can work, right? If we're on top, right? If I'm on top, my opponent can either they can be flat, they can be in referee's position on their knees, they could be sit out, which I would call like a transitional position between being flat and being on your knees. They can be in a quad pod, like a baby stand up, or they can be on their feet, right? Those are pretty much the only positions that a person on bottom can be in without changing the position. And so within each one of those situations, there's a limited number of techniques that are available to me as the offensive or the defensive opponent. And so part of my goal is to try to give the learner a little bit of that positional orientation from which you can actually start to plug in which techniques work best for you. I try to provide the techniques that have worked well for me in my own competitive career, but within each of these sort of overarching positions, there's going to be different techniques that are going to work right for your body, for your strength, for where you are in your own wrestling career. So yeah, that's sort of the beginning, and I hope it's a helpful entry into the rest of the technique on the DVD.
I think that it is, and it had been the way you were breaking it down that day. I'd never heard anybody break it down in that particular manner, but it made a ton of sense. And I can definitely see the jiu-jitsu influences the same way that you would like maybe think about like the different types of guard or something. Mm-hmm. You can start to think about the different maybe like rides that you are starting to apply on top. What are some of the series that you think people will learn on this? You have like a single wrist series, you have some cradle stuff on here, you have your leg series. What are people going to get out of this if they buy Hudson Taylor's top and bottom?
Yeah, so on top, I should say that as much as I pinned a lot of people with legs and with a half, it was really interchangeable with a single wrist. And I think that we would call this it's called the Blair ride in a lot of rooms. The ways in which we sort of ran the single wrist is different and unique. I've talked to Buxton about it and other kind of Blair wrestlers who have graduated after me for a long time. And it's interesting the differences that we all have applied to it. You know, Corey Cooperman has a different way of riding the single wrist than I do, than does Ed Ruth, right? And so there's like these different generational developments and nuances that are really unique to each wrestler. So, but I think the core of it is that single wrist ride in conjunction with leg riding is such a powerful combination that it really enables you to never, like, A, you can always be offensive and looking for the fall, looking for back points, and B, you never have to worry about running the risk of getting a stalemate. Because if I'm ever in a position where I'm losing legs, I can just transition to the single wrist ride. If I'm ever, not progressing with a single wrist ride, I can just transition to my leg series. So a lot of the top work I feel like is really important to connect your offensive sort of pathways together. And then, the other thing that I would just say is on bottom, as good as I was on top and as confident as I am in the material, I scored a lot of back points off bottom as well. I reversed almost everybody in the country as well. So I'm also really excited about the content from bottom, because I think that if nobody can ride, if you can't be ridden, then you're going to be very hard to beat. Right? And that's sort of that inverse of the riding time conversation that we just had, is that, the guys that I had the hardest time with were the guys that I couldn't ride, the guys that got out on bottom. And so I think everything that I show in this series is literally everything you will need to never be ridden again. And, I after I graduated from Maryland, I became an assistant wrestling coach at Columbia for a couple of years. And I think looking at the college wrestling scene, one of the big gaps in a lot of wrestlers' knowledge is the ability to get out on bottom. I saw a lot of great wrestlers who just, put their head down on the mat and went nowhere for several minutes of a match. And it really, really makes it hard to win at an elite level if you can't get out on bottom or you can't ride somebody for an entire period. And this series, if you study it, if you give that time and that attention, I guarantee you will be able to do both.
One thing I definitely want to talk about before we get out of here is the last volume on this is maybe been my favorite one to shoot of any Fanatic series, because it was Unconventional Techniques, right? Yeah, this was really something. I guarantee to anybody out there listening, there's something in here that they haven't seen before, right? So it was you kind of taking these jiu-jitsu concepts and maybe some like freestyle parterre concepts and working around the top position to find all these turns that are really both effective. They actually do work. They're not just, theoretically possible, but also, they're very innovative. Can you kind of take me through this section?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's one of the things that I was always doing at Maryland and I'm super passionate about, is the evolution of our sport. I think that, right now, the ways in which we attack on top are direct lineage of what we were taught, what came before, right? And there's this sort of connection of technique that, it's good. It does change. There are modifications, but I think that we still remain within these sort of staples of technique that aren't necessarily the only pathways. And that has become super clear to me also in looking at jiu-jitsu and learning jiu-jitsu. In wrestling, the top wrestler is almost always trying to attack and turn the bottom wrestler with, my arms and hands are attacking your arms and hands, and my legs and hips are always attacking your legs and hips. That's kind of the blueprint for wrestling. And jiu-jitsu is really different in that respect, in that I think in jiu-jitsu, technique really allows your legs to attack the upper body in different ways. And your hands and your hands and arms are attacking the legs in different ways. And I think that there's a lot that wrestling can take from that alternative way of thinking. And so, again, I started to get into jiu-jitsu while I was coaching, while I was still competing a little bit. And so a lot of that experimental technique is what I was able to really try in the college wrestling room, try with other college wrestlers. And yeah, it's definitely unconventional. It is definitely pretty funky, but I also think that if you can be a, let's say 5 out of 10 at a skill set, and the person that you're competing against is a 0 out of 10 in defending it, you're going to find some success with that technique. And so a lot of that section of the DVD is really trying to help. Let's think about those different directions of attack, that maybe they're outside the box, maybe they're unconventional, but if your opponent doesn't have any defense to it, they're going to be highly susceptible to it. I think we've seen it in jiu-jitsu with the whole leg lock game. I mean, if you're not aware of the leg entanglements and heel hooks, you see people who are just so ill-matched for one another because of that technical gap. And I think that there's room in wrestling to explore technique in new ways. I think that with the danger rule, we've seen some really interesting back points happening that are different, that are outside the box. I mean, you could almost say that I've seen some like kind of Kimura trap type positions, using the legs to really trap the chest against the mat and expose for back points. So that experimental section is really just an effort to try to help get you to think in new different directions. I've tried to put together techniques that have and do work and have worked for me, but also, to each their own. I mean, I think that the beautiful thing about our sport is that if it works, it works. And just because it doesn't exist today doesn't mean it won't someday exist. And I think that my hope is that I inspire other wrestlers to try new things, to try new grips, new ways of pushing, of pulling, of controlling, because you just never know what technique you'll find, which will become, the staple of every wrestler, in the future. The Peterson didn't exist before the Peterson brothers hit the Peterson, right? Like, so.
In the low single we were talking about earlier, John Smith slipped one day and we suddenly had this brand new world championship technique. You know what I mean?
Right? Yeah. So, there's definitely a lot of my thoughts about kind of thinking differently about, even, I think we did one, which was a different way of finishing a single leg.
The reverse.
Yeah. So there's some funky stuff in there, and if you check it out, if you have questions, I encourage you to please contact me. I love thinking about this. I love talking about it. If you have your own takes and refinements, please let the entire Fanatic Wrestling community know. Absolutely.
The more we can, like you said, we saw it in jiu-jitsu, especially I think with BJJ Fanatics, kind of to pat ourselves on the back a little bit, is when all this technique started coming out, the game started evolving much faster because people weren't just learning from their own coaches, they were learning from everybody's coaches. And so they're starting to pick up these nuances and these new positions. And I would love, that would be a dream come true if that could happen in wrestling as well. Just to see the game, which is evolving very fast, but even just to throw some lighter fluid on that and get it going even faster, I think it's for the benefit of everybody, especially me as a fan. Hudson, one last thing that I want to talk to you about is your activism work, which I think is fantastic. It's something I've always admired about you. You run I hope I'm getting it right, nonprofit Athlete Ally. Can you tell me about the mission and the work with Athlete Ally?
Yeah, so Athlete Ally is a nonprofit organization that I started really right out of college. So 2011 started Athlete Ally, and our mission is to end homophobia in sports. And so for me, I should say this wasn't something that I was knowledgeable about, passionate about, but I was involved in the theater, so I had a lot of gay friends who were coming out and being treated with dignity and respect, and it was such a non-issue. And then being a part of the wrestling community, I heard homophobic language. I used homophobic language. I think it's still unfortunately a part of our culture in some ways. And I realized that as a leader of my team, as somebody who really I love our sport. I think it is the best sport in the world. that I have a responsibility to try to make it as welcoming and accepting as possible. And that means that I want every athlete who wants to pursue their goals in wrestling, I want them to feel comfortable. I want them to have a team, have a family that supports them on and off the wrestling mat. And that includes gay athletes. And so, you know, my senior year at Maryland, I was ranked number 2 in the country, training to win that national title. I decided to wear an LGBTQ equality sticker on my headgear to show support. And in response to that, I got about 2,000 emails from closeted athletes from across the country.
Wow.
And it was really those emails that changed my life, that made me realize, you know.
Were these just wrestlers, or were these other sports as well?
All sorts of different sports, different age groups.
Because Athlete Ally, it's not like we're not just focusing on ending homophobia in wrestling. You're saying ending homophobia in sports. All
sports, absolutely.
Gotcha.
Yeah, because I mean, look, you can be running a wrestling program that's welcoming and accepting and super respectful, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the team next door has a great culture.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, it's about anybody who wants to maximize their potential in sport should be able to do so, regardless of their sexual orientation, regardless of their gender identity. And that only happens if we talk about it, if we try to be a bit more intentional with our language, if we actively try to, you know, make our sports spaces more accepting. So I've spent the last, 9 years now doing ally education with teams and leagues across the country, do a lot of sport policy work, trying to get athletic departments to adopt more inclusive policies. And we also do a tremendous amount of athlete activism, trying to help athletes use their platform to make the world a better place. So for me, it's really like, I believe that sport can change the world if everybody could thrive in it, if everybody had a wonderful relationship with sport. Unfortunately, only 24% of LGBT youth play sports, and those that do drop out of sport at twice the rate of their heterosexual counterparts. So we're really missing out on an entire talent pool of kids, of people who could really help our sport, help sports in general. And I think we have a responsibility to do something about it. So yeah, thanks for giving me that chance to plug in. And if you want to learn more, you can check us out at athleteally.org or on Twitter, on Instagram, on all those other places. But
everywhere, right? Athlete Ally. Man, well, I've always been so impressed with the work that you guys do, and I was so impressed. When I showed up to college and I started working out with the Maryland team and getting my butt kicked, you were always, somebody who was taking care of everybody in the room. You know what I mean? Making sure everybody felt super welcome. And I always thought that was so admirable. So then when I found out about your activism work, it wasn't surprising. It fit with my understanding of you very much so. Hudson, this has been fantastic. You've been so generous with your time. I feel like I could talk to you for hours and hours trying to pick your brain about wrestling. But before we go, is there anywhere that, anything you want to plug, anywhere that people can reach you, Instagram, maybe something like that?
Yeah, you can find me at Hudsonism on Twitter, on Instagram. And I just would say that, wrestling is a really difficult sport. It really makes you kind of look your ego in the face, and it challenges you every single time you step into the practice room, step out onto the wrestling mat. But if you're patient, if you practice, if you really commit yourself to those little details, I think that everybody can excel in wrestling to some degree, to really get back what you put in. So I hope that my work with Fanatic Wrestling can kind of help you on your journey to be a better wrestler, to even maybe be a better coach, to think about how you teach other people the sport of wrestling. But regardless, I'm grateful for the opportunity to share what I've learned from my wrestling career, and looking forward to continuing to grow the community, grow the sport, and share as much knowledge as possible.
Oh, it's big. Huge honor for me, Hudson. Thank you very much for for spending your time here today. And I hope I see you again soon.
Awesome. Thanks so much.